I want to welcome everyone to another one of our monthly gatherings. To further the work of our presbytery and our commitment to dismantling structural racism, grappling with the issue of white supremacy and anti-Blackness in our congregations, in our presbytery, and according to the commitments we make as a Matthew 25 denomination, our denomination. We are quite pleased and in anticipatory humbleness to hear from our speaker today, Dr. Kenneth Hardy, who is one of the leading voices in these issues, particularly as it relates to identifying racial harm and healing racial trauma. He is our keynote speaker today, and we look forward to hearing from him and continuing to challenge ourselves to live up to the commitments that we have made. So I want to begin with some housekeeping, some things that you should know. We do have interpretation today, Spanish, English interpretation. And if you look at your task bar, for me, it's at the bottom of my screen. Depending upon what device you're using, it may be at the top of your screen. Look across there and see if you see a globe that says interpretation. If you click that globe, then it will ask which language do you want to hear. If you want to hear English, please click English. If you want to hear Spanish, please click Spanish. That will be available to you throughout our meeting today. I will also say at a certain point, we will go into breakout rooms. And so if you want to hear, if you speak Spanish and you want to hear and speak in Spanish, you're going to stay in the main room. If you get invited to go into a breakout room, do not click to join. Just stay where you are. If you click later, it'll leave you alone. But if you don't have to click anything, then you can stay in the main room where the translation will be from English into Spanish. We will have also, after Dr. Hardy's presentation, about 15 minutes or so for question and answer. And we're going to use the raise hand function during that period of time. If you would like to ask Dr. Hardy a question, much more questions than statements, we'd encourage you, if you want to ask a question more than make a statement, because you will be in a small group where you will have a chance to talk. But if you want to ask him a question, please use the raise hand feature, and then when I invite you, you will be invited to unmute yourself and then ask your question. And we encourage you to use speaker view after we begin so that you can focus on the speakers who are going to be talking with you. Right now, everyone is on mute and will remain so until you're asked to unmute. So let us begin. So very shortly, we're going to have a land acknowledgement, and we know that in this part of the country, the Ohlone and the Miwok people had been the indigenous caretakers of the land, and we want to make sure that we acknowledge these things. Let's begin now.
What I've learned from my elders is that when we do acknowledgement of the land, it's not about acknowledging whose land it belongs to, because that indigenous worldview, we never owned the land. We were simply caretakers of it for future generations. And what I've been taught from my elders is that when we do that acknowledgement of the land, it's much more than just the territory. It's about relationships. It's about our relationships with people that share the land. It's our relationships with Mother Earth. It's our relationships with the four-legged, the finned, the feathered, the crawlers, the original stewards of Mother Earth. It's that relationship that we acknowledge with trees. It's that acknowledgement that we have with the plant life. That is part of the food chain and helps us exist. It gives us our medicines for healing, gives us food for nutrients, it gives us our medicines for ceremonies. We acknowledge water. Water is sacred, water is life. And what we're told is that when we acknowledge that water, that we always have to acknowledge the carriers of those teachings, which are the woman. So we do that in the same voice. We also acknowledge the infinite wisdom of the grandfathers. Then we take that to the next level, is which acknowledging that relationship that we have with father's son, or in some nations, brother's son. We acknowledge that relationship that we have with Nokomis, Grandma Moon, and how she cleanses Mother Earth. We acknowledge that relationship that we have with our distant relations, the star people. So when we talk about acknowledging the land, it's so much more so than just acknowledging what nation was on that. As we know all throughout the history of Turtle Island, is that indigenous people were, for the most part, nomadic people. They shifted. They would move from season to season. It just so happens that Sheridan sits on the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, which I'm very proud to always share and educate with people. But in the same breath, I also acknowledge that many, many other nations have walked this territory, and that their ancestors are still here amongst us.
For the reviewing of the children.
All creation groans, all creation labors, because we have not yet fully come into what God has made us to be. Part of the reason for that is white supremacy and structural racism that have bound us all. And we are determined in our presbytery, in our denomination, and hopefully in our congregations to get free. So what we're doing then is the work of getting free. We have invited Dr. Hardy here today to help us to get free. This is how we do it, how we unbind our hearts and release our bodies into the freedom that God made us to live into. Through the work, according to our Matthew 25 commitments, our three foci, of vitalizing our congregations. Doing that by dismantling structural racism and ending systemic poverty. The initial temptation, of course, is to ask the question, okay, so what should we do? What should we do about this? Let's take to the streets, let's demonstrate, let's have joint worship services, let's pray together. Yes, all of those. However, there's another more important question we must ask first. And that is, who are we called to be in this moment? Because it is true that many jump into doing because they want to avoid the being question. Who shall we be? How do we get ready to make ourselves ready to come alongside Black people and Indigenous people and people of color? How do we get ready? What do we look at inside of ourselves prior to asking the question, what do we want to do for others? How can white people and non-Black people of color be allies to Black, Indigenous, and other folks of color? These are the questions Dr. Hardy has come to ask us to ponder. And you may have already read his bio information we've provided to you. I can tell you that though I have not met him in person, I have had the privilege of hearing 2 of his presentations and watching numerous of his YouTube videos and sharing those both with you and with members of our congregation as we grapple with these issues as well. He is a practitioner, he is a therapist, he is a teacher, a leader, and someone who speaks the truth in a way that is irresistible. So glad to have him today. Welcome, Dr. Kenneth Hardy.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. And just want to take a moment to thank each of you for taking the time out of your personal lives to be a part of this forum. When I think about where we are literally today with regard to race relationships in this country and beyond, it is truly inspirational to look into the screen and see so many people who have come together today for part of this conversation, that I'm at a place in my life now where I'm looking for even the smallest pearls of hope along the way, because so much of our lives are penned against a backdrop of despair and misery. And so thank you so much in a most heartfelt way for being a part of this. I also want to say that it is deeply my honor and privilege to have this opportunity. And I know that the politically correct, perfunctory thing to say at moments like this is to say that I'm delighted to be here to do this. In this instance, I am genuinely delighted to be here because I consider this work, and while we're all convened here, and the work of your presbytery to be a part of my life's appointed mission. And so this isn't a job for me. It is my work. And the difference between a job and work is a job is confined to hours, place, and space. Work is what we do on behalf of the planet to take advantage of the time that we have to make sure we do everything humanly possible and beyond to leave the planet a better place for those who inherit it from us. And so it is a real honor to have this opportunity. I did want to share a couple of thoughts I have about assumptions I make that provide a framework for doing this work and for becoming an ally. And the first is that I operate from the assumption that each and every one of us, a part of this platform, has been socialized racially, that we have been socialized racially, and the ways in which we have been socialized racially is predicated on what our race is. So the racial socialization process, I believe, is racialized. And what I believe is that for people of color, and Black people in particular, that we are racially socialized and we know that we are. So it is rare that you find a person of color, and most notably a Black person, who doesn't know that he or she is Black as early as age 3 or 4. That I knew at age 4 that I was Black because my parents and grandmother who lived with us made a point to tell me that. And it wasn't just idle talk. It served a purpose. They wanted me to know that as a person of color, that I was about to embrace a world out there that wouldn't necessarily reciprocate and hold me in warm embrace. And they wanted me to be prepared for that. And so we often hear about the talk that occurs in families of color. Well, the talk is specifically a talk about race. I juxtapose that with what happens in white families, that it is not commonplace that children in white families are socialized to know that they're white. The fact of the matter is, it's just not commonplace in white families for parents to say to their child, "You're white." But nevertheless, the socialization process takes place anyway. It's just that it's indirect. And so the messages that white people get early on in life as children about race are more subtle, more implicit, less direct. The message that children of color get much more explicit. Now, I thought it's important to start here because the significance of this is that if you think about it for a moment, and if I had more time, and if we had more time here, I would actually do an exercise here just to drive home the point. So if I've been thinking about race since I was age 4, and most of the white counterparts I interact with have not thought critically about themselves as white. The issue is not whether you ever thought about race. That's not the question. The question is, have you thought about yourself as a white person? That the fact of the matter is that most white people tell me when I do workshops like this that, well, I first developed that awareness at age 24 or 34 or 58. It happens much later in life for white people. And so I wanted to start here because not to be cynical, but to suggest that if I've been thinking about this issue of race since age 4, all of my life, and recognizing the ways in which it impacts every single aspect of my life, and the white person with whom I interact with has been somewhat oblivious to it, haven't thought about it until much later in life, I hope you can see and hope you will agree that our contexts at that point are very different. And when our contexts are different, our realities are different. And so what happens is that through the eyes of white people, because I've been organized by race since age 4, the judgment is that, well, you're making too much to do about race, that you're over-endowing the significance of race. But from my perspective, I'm not over-endowing it because it's been a fundamental part of my life, all my life, that race for people of color dictates where we live, how we live, and as we're seeing, even how long we live. That we're living in the midst of COVID that affects us all. And as the pundits say, COVID doesn't discriminate. It affects us all. It doesn't care whether you're tall or short, rich, white, poor. But the fact of the matter is, the impact and the consequences of COVID are affecting Black and brown communities much more disproportionately. So even there, we're dying at higher rates. That is very much a function of race. So I'm not here to sort of lecture you, nor do you need a lecture about the significance of race in our society. I think we all recognize that. But I do want to say that when we interact cross-racially, that our contexts are different, and so our realities are different. So there's very little common ground that we, Black and white, Black, brown, and white, can look at the same phenomena and yet see something very differently. And what happens is that we have no way to bridge the chasm that creates. And why is that? It's because we don't have good models for how to talk in meaningful, substantive, sustainable ways about race. That there's a kind of awkwardness that we all have in our efforts to talk about race. And so I believe that in order for us to be, and for white people to be good, effective cross-racial allies, it does require work. And the thing that I appreciate about Reverend Hassan, when we shared a platform, I love the idea, as he did today, introducing this notion of being, because I think it's so critical to the work. And so before I even get into the tactics and the techniques for how to be an effective cross-racial ally, I do want to say and acknowledge that the first part of this work involves us looking within. And so I think that there are three critical steps that one has to traverse in order to to position oneself to be an effective ally. And those three steps, those three stages that we have to traverse are seeing, being, and doing. And I know that in the urgency of the now, and given the enormity of the racial difficulties in our society, it makes sense that each of us want to move rather expeditiously to the doing, because the urgency of the now requires that. But what I'm suggesting, and what I would like to submit to you, is that it is premature to delve into the doing if one has not done the seeing and the being. And so seeing is about, how do we train our eyes to look at what we've always looked at, but this time around, dare to see it differently. We're training our eyes to see all the ways that race is so intricately and subtly intertwined in virtually everything that we do, that we all recognize the robust manifestations of this. We can look at the George Floyd situation and say, oh, yes, that was racial. But the thing we miss are all the ways in which race is right under our nose in a very powerful way, and the subtleties of it, and we don't see it. And we don't see it because some of our eyes have not been trained to see it. Quite frankly, what I would suggest is that the eyes of many white people have not been trained to see it, that people of color live this on a daily basis. And if you don't see it as a person of color, it's a threat to your life. So it becomes imperative that you see it. And so once we have begun to move through that phase of seeing, then being is the next phase. And the being is about a kind of existential inquiry. Who am I? What do I believe in? What do I stand for? And now that I see what my eyes heretofore has never been able to see, what is my responsibility? Because I always say that I think the process of moving is seeing. It is so powerful, it is so potent that it always makes me want to go back and change the lyrics to Amazing Grace. To say, I was once blind, but now I see. And oh my goodness, seeing is not all it's cracked up to be. Because once you begin to see, you cannot unsee. And that's why it's so important. But it's also true that once you begin to see, you feel commission to do. And so I think we can't do the doing until we've done the seeing and the being. Once we've done that, then I think we are positioned and poised to then put into place these tasks, if you will, the tips that one must employ to be an effective cross-racial ally. And so I want to walk us through those right now. So the first is that becoming an effective cross-racial ally is one has to know thyself as a racial being. Know thyself as a racial being. And so what this means for white people is asking oneself, what does it mean to be white? And I'm suggesting to take the deep dive there, to not answer so quickly, oh, well, it means that people think I have privilege. No, I want that question to sit and simmer a bit. What does it really mean to be white? Because what I believe is that it is rare that white people ask that question of themselves. It is rare. And so we have a situation, a circumstance where people of color hardly make any decisions that don't take into account the thought, the attitudes, the behavior of white people. That I think that white people occupy full-time space in the heads of people of color. Because you have to. It's survival. But I don't think the reverse is true for white people. I know that people of color are constantly thinking, if I do this, what will white people think of me? I don't know that white people routinely walk around saying, if I do this, how will this affect a person of color's life? I mean, there may be some few people who do, but for the most part, that's not a part of the world we live in. And so part of this knowing thyself also means not only do you ask and answer the question for yourself, what does it mean to be white? But it also requires us to ask, what do I have to give up? What do I have to compromise? What do I have to do differently to achieve the ideals that I hold with regard to race relationships? What am I willing to give up? And the third question that's embedded in the desire to know oneself as a racial being, and this is a difficult one. What are the implicit and internalized messages that I have regarding people of color, and particularly Black people, that help perpetuate or sustain anti-Blackness and contribute to the oppression of people of color? What are the implicit and internalized messages? And if we had all day to do this and we unmuted everybody's mics, and if you were to say, I have no implicit internalized messages, it's possible you're being honest about that, but I would not believe you. Because how could we not have internalized messages when our society is replete with them? What does the internalized message say that 44 out of 45 presidents in this country have been white? I'll come back later for another talk to also acknowledge male as well, and presumably heterosexual. But what is the implicit message about that? What is the implicit message that every last one of us, all 221 of us on this call, walk around on a daily basis with currency in our pockets, all of which bear the images of white people? And we say we live in a multiracial society. We say we live in a multicultural society, and yet every single piece of currency that we have bears the image of white people. What does it say about whiteness in our society? What does it say about all of us who are not white? Where do we fit in? Where are we acknowledged? And this is on top of the fact that predominantly all the major corporations, university presidents, you look throughout our society, all inundated with white faces. What is the implicit message? That these are troubling aspects of our society, that it's a kind of ugliness that we don't want to look at. And because we don't look at it, it impedes our ability to make the kinds of substantive changes that we all say we wish to make. And so I think that first step is about how do we know thyself as a racial being? The second step to becoming an effective racial ally is that it's imperative that we all engage in a process of self-examination, self-interrogation, and self-reflection. Self-examination, self-interrogation, self-reflection. This means we're asking ourselves, what did I do with those racist messages that I heard my grandpa use, or that came up at family picnics or family reunions? I absorbed those messages, even if I don't say them myself. What happened to them? Do they still live inside of me? Do they formulate the basis for implicit biases that I have, although I actually reject the very existence of those messages? What is my racial biography? Like, what I know about the family I grew up in over 3 generations, and what was their racial legacy? When it comes to race, what is it that I know better, but still do? How do the choices I make help to sustain racism in our society, though I I shun and repudiate racism myself? What are the ways in which I might be complicit with it? Because what happens is no one in our society, or maybe very few, will acknowledge that he, she, or they are racist. So we have this rather peculiar situation in our society. Nobody's a racist, but racism persists. How is that? How do we make sense out of that? The third step to becoming an effective cross-racial ally is that we have to develop what I refer to increase our capacity for CIRO. Increase our capacity for CIRO. And CIRO is an acronym for self in relationship to other. Self in relationship to other. And it is a kind of relational accountability. And so this CIRO means that that when I have privilege, the more privilege we have, the greater the likelihood that we only have to be concerned with and concerned about how I see myself. That when you don't have privilege and when your life has been locked along the margins of society on the basis of poverty or gender or race, you have to be hyper concerned about how you are seen. So people of color walk through the world hypersensitive to how we are seen. But I don't know that white people who enjoy white privilege, that part of the privilege of privilege is to have it, not know you have it. And so CIRO is, how do I begin to see myself in relationship to others, rather separate and apart from others? And some of you may take exception to this, but I think that part of what ails our country right now is that we've lost this ability to see the reflections and images of other through ourselves. That we've lost that. And when we lose when we lose that self in relationship to other, that is hard to have empathy. It's hard, like, what happened to that policeman or the policeman in Minneapolis as they're kneeing George Floyd to death? Why was it not possible for them to see what I saw? I saw someone's child there, someone's father, someone's sibling. What broke down that was not possible? And so if we want to do the work of an ally, we have to develop this CIRO effect. And that it means that what we do in the bright of day, when everybody's watching, is exactly what we do in the darkest of all dark nights when nobody's watching with regard to race. It doesn't mean that I speak up and I advocate when people of color are present and then remain silent when they're not. That's not the effective behavior of a cross-racial ally. The fourth step is recognizing that being an ally is not about what one says or what one plans to do or what one intends to do, but rather dictated by what one does. It's not about what you did yesterday. It's about what you're doing now and what you will execute tomorrow. That what we do is not a single act. It's not like we do it, check off the list, done that, time to move on. No, it's ongoing, it's continual. It continues and it persists as long as the problem persists. The fifth step is that we must exchange white saviorship for white servantship. And so when one wants to be an ally, one has to become a servant, not a savior. There is a critical difference. And when I say servant, I'm not thinking of servant in the sense of like slavery, for example. What I am speaking about is that what the white savior does is endeavors to save an individual. What the servant does is challenges racism. It's not individually focused. So the white person who comes to my assistance in a meeting when I've been ignored is saving me, but it does nothing for dismantling racism. That the servant becomes that I am essentially called to do this work, and I'm taking it on. Where is the focus of the work? The focus of the work is wherever I stand. So it's not like my students who say, I can't wait until I finish my degree and I get out in the world, be in a position to change the world. I'm always saying to them, the best position to change the world from is the position you're currently standing in. What are you waiting for? That the servant remains committed to dismantling racism and doing the work, even when one is not in power. The servant also is one who has learned to use their power and privilege responsibly. And so what I believe is that being white is like being male. It's an unearned privilege that we can't blink our eyes and say, okay, I want to get rid of this privilege, that we have it and it's enduring. But what I think it does require us to do is to acknowledge that we have privilege. And some white people are still at the point where they're debating that point. I heard the president say just last week that he doesn't believe that white privilege exists. That means our work is really cut out for us. Because if you can't see the privileges that are bestowed upon whiteness, there's something deeply impaired with one's vision. And I'm acknowledging that none of us bargained for this. It's unearned. And because it's unearned, we can't just expunge it at our pleasure. We can't do that. But what we can do is acknowledge that we have it, and then secondly, develop a relationship with it so that we can use it responsibly. And so I think that those of us who are blessed and privileged with privilege have minimally three possibilities: that you can ignore your privilege, in which case you misuse it. You can deny your privilege, in which case you abuse it. Or you can acknowledge your privilege and then use it responsibly. And when you use your privilege responsibly, you recognize that to whom much is given, much is expected. And that because I have more, I have to give more. That because I have more, I have to hold more. That is how you use privilege responsibly. And here's the metric that you can use to help you determine when you're using your privilege responsibly. When you use your privilege responsibly, it becomes a burden, not a luxury. If it feels like a luxury to have it, and I'm luxuriating in it, then we should rest assured that someone else somewhere is suffering mightily because of that. Because we're in relationship with each other. If I have more, it means someone with whom I'm connected has less. And when I don't use it responsibly, then I am reneging on a responsibility that is attached to using privilege responsibly. The sixth task that we take on to become an effective cross-racial ally is to commit to living an integrated life that is not on your terms. So to commit to living an integrated life that's not on your own terms. So what it means is, as a white person, I'm no longer satisfied. I'm no longer fulfilled in my humanity when I recognize that much of my interactions and most of my existence takes place in the context of other white people. I'm always in the midst of groups and milieus and places and spaces where I'm a part of the majority. I think what it means is that one has the bandwidth to thrust oneself in context where I am no longer the majority. I am no longer the rule maker, where I don't even know what the rules of engagement are. It is one of the benefits that I have gained from traveling outside the country. It's the thing I love and the thing I hate. When I'm outside the country, I enjoy something about that experience because it opens my eyes, it enables me to see the world through another lens. And the thing that I absolutely abhor about it is that there's something discomforting about not knowing the rules. It could be even something benign. It could be like I'm in a cab in Costa Rica, and that momentary discomfort of not knowing, do I tip the cab driver or not? I no longer know the rules. And what that does, it allows me to see myself differently. It allows me to increase that Syro self in relationship to other. So when I'm on the platform waiting for the E train in New York City with hundreds of people on the platform, I'm able to look through that crowded platform and see that one person standing there who doesn't have to say, my gosh, I need help. I'm lost. I'm overwhelmed by the crowd and the freneticism of New York. I can see that person at the other end of the platform. I see that person because at some point in my life, on a platform in Tokyo, I was that person. And so I don't have to wait for that person to come up to me and say, hey, can you tell me which train to get on? I go to him, I go to her. That increased Syro, that's being outside of my own comfort zone, helps to build that. And if we're honest, there are plenty of white people who rarely find themselves in situations where they are not either part of the majority, numerically the majority, or not the most powerful. And it doesn't really count if you're a white person and you're in the presence of a large group of people of color, but you still hold much of the power. That's not exactly what I'm getting at. I'm suggesting to be in a space where the rules of engagement are clearly unclear. There's something about that that helps us develop and grow, and it empowers us and emboldens us being a cross-racial ally. The number seven task is to commit to becoming racial lingual. And racial lingual is a word I've made up, but it means learning the language of race. That you can't be an ally if you can't speak. And you can't speak if you don't know the language of race. And I've seen some whites who are committed to doing this work and stumble over things like, well, is it Afro-American or African-American? Is it Black or African? Is it Latinx? Is it Hispanic, Chicana? Struggling. And so that we have to develop this proficiency in the language of race if we wish to be an ally. Number 8, it is absolutely essential that one learns how and absolutely takes advantage of exercising one's voice proactively with regard to race. And so that what it means is that as a white person, you're not waiting for race to be introduced before you acknowledge it or you co-sign it. No, you're initiating conversations. You're in a meeting and you're asking, I wonder what it means that we don't have any people of color at the table. And I wonder how that's influencing our broader racial inclusion initiative here, where you're proactively, not reactively, speaking on behalf of race. Number 9, I think it's important for each of us on this call, if not already, to identify and adopt a dimension of structural racism that you pledge to work on consistently. That not everybody has to do the same thing, but everybody has to do something. And so what is your pet what is the dimension of structural racism that you're taking on? Is it that which affects schools and children's performances in schools? Is it the healthcare system? Is it looking at local government? What is the dimension of structural racism that you are taking on as a part of your role as an ally? And then the final thing I want to suggest is that it becomes important for that once whites and non-Black people of color have identified themselves as racial beings, it becomes important to take on the task of the privilege. And what I believe is there's certain things, when I talk about using our privilege responsibly, what it means is that when we have cross-racial relationships, that we're not expecting that there to be equality in those relationships. We're not expecting it to be equal responsibility. Because when conversation between white people and people of color take place, if the expectation is that both groups are equally responsible in those conversations, that will de facto disadvantage the person of color. Because you cannot have equal responsibility in a relationship for which power and privilege is not distributed equally. That's why we hold parents accountable for things that we don't hold children accountable for. If you don't have the same power, it doesn't make sense that you would have equal responsibility. So here are a couple of tasks that I think that white people need to be able to perfect in cross-racial conversations within keeping of becoming an effective racial ally. And I'll just go over a couple of these as time will permit. So the first is, I think it's important to distinguish between intentions and consequences. That anytime there's a cross-racial conversation, a person of color says, I'm offended, that hurt me, I thought that was racist. You can't be an effective ally if your response to that is, oh, I'm sorry, that wasn't my intention. Because intentionality is always in the province of the privilege. Intentionality is a privileged conversation. If a person of color is saying that they've been hurt or felt dismissed by exchange, the aspiring white ally will respond by focusing on the consequences which are connected to the person of color, not the intentions which are connected to the white person. So that the response is not, that wasn't my intention, but rather, I appreciate you letting me know that what I said was hurtful to you. As opposed to saying, that wasn't my intention. When the person in the privileged position clarifies an intention, that's about them. When you address the consequence, that's about the relationship. And so I'm hoping that we remain invested in the relationship. A second task that white people have to accomplish on the path to becoming around this task of the privilege in conversation is to develop thick skin. Because the thickening of the skin is necessary for there to be honest, wholesome, hearty, cross-racial conversations. And so here's some tips about how you can thicken your skin as an aspiring ally. 1, in your conversations with people of color, expect rejection, but stay committed to the relationship. That's how you use your privilege responsibly. Those who have more, to whom much is given, much is expected. Those who have more have to give more. Secondly, expect your credibility, your integrity, and your trustworthiness to be questioned, but stay in a relationship. Because the fact of the matter is, the thing that we don't talk about in the society is that there is an absence of goodwill and an absence of trust in the cross-racial relationships in this society. How could there be anything else? How can we place the Japanese in camps, and even though we certainly apologize, expect there to be trust in the relationship? How can we have Black people in slavery for 247 years and then 100 years of Jim Crow? In the 401 years that Black people have been in this country, less than 50 has been enjoyed as a free person. And I would say free with an asterisk. How can we move the southern border and put children in cages and expect Latinx population to trust? The trust between us is ruptured. And we can't have a relationship without there being trust. And so one should expect one's credibility and trustworthiness to be questioned. And that should not dictate one's commitment to the relationship. And thirdly, and finally, to be in those conversations, that the thickening of the skin requires that white people be in a position where you can accept and receive strong affect, so that we don't find ourselves saying to that Black male or to that Latinx woman, you know, I could hear you better if you lower your voice. I could hear you better if you weren't so angry. No, what it means that we're able to participate in that relationship without making mandates of the person, because those mandates are designed to make us comfortable rather than to advance the relationship along. So I hope that these nuggets have been helpful. That I always think that those of us who do this work have minimally three choices when we think about who it is and how it is we wish to be. Minimally three choices. There's a healer, there's a helper, and there's a jailer. And what the jailer does is perpetuate the status quo. The jailer, the familiar refrain of the jailer is, I'm just trying to do my job. I don't make the rules. Well, you know what? In the world we live in, just trying to do your job is not enough. That if we want to move the needle here, we have to do more than just do our jobs. And the helper is the person who's always there to pick up the pieces when pieces fall apart, because they do in fact fall apart. But the helper does nothing to thwart or circumvent the suffering before it happens, but they're there to pick up the pieces when they shatter. But the healer is a manufacturer of hope. The healer recognizes that we're in a hope manufacturing business, and that when we aspire to be healers, it doesn't matter what the backdrop of despair is, that we recognize that we have to hold hope in places where hope has long since ceased to exist. My hope is that each and every one of you on this platform will aspire to be a healer. Thank you very much.
Brothers and sisters, I have been deeply touched yet again by this presentation. And what if we did a gallery view and just did our hand wave to thank Dr. Hardy for this amazing presentation, and to show that we heard. Blessings. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Doc.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So we are preparing for a short time of questions and answers, about 15 minutes. We want to encourage you, if you have a question, not a statement that you'd like to make, but there will be some time for conversation after this part of our meeting. But if you have a question for Dr. Hardy, we encourage you to go to your participants icon, and you can do the hand raise function, and then we will we'll acknowledge you, and then you will be able to ask your question. We will also continue with having Spanish and English translation. So I see Doreen Ewert. Doreen, you may unmute and ask your question.
Hi, thank you very much. I am profoundly moved and impacted by your presentation. There's much for me to work on and think about. I have one question, and it's a point that I can connect quite quickly because I'm a linguist. And I think it is reflective of the larger issue of how we actually get into cross-racial relationships in some respect. And that is my question about your made-up word, which of course I love, racial lingual proficiency, which of course I aspire to. And yet it is it's troubled territory in many ways. And as a linguist, language is always in flux, and identity language is even more particularly in flux. If I want to be more proficient, how do I do that in the context where even within a group like Latinx, there's a great deal of agreement and disagreement about what that racial term means?
Well, thank you, Doreen. I appreciate your question. But see, I think just that exposure, knowing that is a part of being racial lingual. That I know that when that there are folks from the to use that example, broader culture who, if I'm in the West, it is much more likely that people think of themselves as Hispanic. In New York City, much more Latinx. And so I don't get to decide what label I put on people, right. but it's incumbent upon me to know what the range of those experiences are. Mm-hmm. And so here's the difference between, I believe, growing up a person of color in the United States of America and growing up white, right. Is I have to know everything about white people in order to survive in this society. Mm-hmm. I have to know it. And that, I'm saying you, but I don't mean you personally, yeah. But you don't have to know about me. You don't have to know about anybody on this platform who's not white. And it poses no threat to your life whatsoever. But what it does is it fractures our sense of humanity, is what it does. And so my thing is that I find that I've had to learn all I know about functioning in the United States by being in situations sometimes that were excruciatingly painful because the experience was so foreign to what I grew up exposed to. But it was on-the-job training for me. And for white people, often want to watch a YouTube video or read a book or watch a documentary. It's the path of least resistance. And so my thing is, if you're really committed about, and again, I don't mean, my reference to you is not you. I'm not lecturing to you. Mm-hmm. But what it means is that white people have to get out of their comfort zone and do exactly what we people of color have to do. Just a short story. I remember there was a point, and this wasn't solely about race, but it was about class as well. I was going to be in an Oprah Winfrey show, and the night before the show, we went to dinner, a bunch of us, and we got up to dinner, and just this very exquisite place. And when I looked, there were about 12 pieces of silverware in front of me. And I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, like, damn, what did the other two, what did that 10 for? I only need 2. No idea, because I'm out of my universe at that point. Yeah. But that's the kind of discomfort that we all have to undergo to be who we ultimately wish to be. Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Cal Chin.
Thank you. So the term that I've heard throughout that sends chills through me from whites is replacement. I mean, that speaks volumes, not only of the discomfort, but the fear of losing one's privilege. So folks who use that and throw that out clearly know that they're losing their privilege. They know they have privilege. They don't want to lose it. So I'm sure that your answer is embedded in my 4-page of notes here, which I wish I could have taken more. But
Thank
I
you.
would appreciate just hearing you. If I, as a person of color, wanted to speak with someone who's living with that kind of fear, extreme fear, how might I approach such a person?
Well, I think there's several. One is that if privilege is all that it is proclaimed to be, then what is the rationale for why all of us should not be able to enjoy the fruits of that? But secondly, I offer something even much more pragmatic, which is that if you are a parent, and I don't mean you, but do you agree that every mother should be able to sleep peacefully at night, knowing that her child is safe?
Hmm.
Wouldn't you want that? I mean, it's like my mother said to me that literally, Kenny, the day after you were born, the night before you were born, was the last day I ever had a peaceful night's sleep.
Hmm.
Shouldn't my mother have that same right to sleep peacefully at night and not worry? Shouldn't everyone have a right to like basic health care that you have right there in the Bay Area? I've spent the last 4 years working with the San Francisco Department of Public Health, where the life expectancy for Black men 5 to 7 years less than what it is for white men. Shouldn't everyone have the opportunity to live an optimal life? And how do you enjoy that? How do you enjoy that knowing that it's reserved for the precious few? I had a woman in Illinois tell me once, it wasn't Chicago, white woman, she said, I don't agree with what my people have done to yours, but my fear is that if you all ever get on top in charge, you'll do to us what we've done to you. And my response to her was, you're getting us confused with you, because that's not who we are as a people. It is difficult for me to understand what white people's fear is of, for example, Black people and people of color, when we have no history. We have no history of groups of us terrorizing white people, and you're afraid of us, but you have a protracted history of creating havoc on our lives. And so that group of Black folks in South Carolina at the Emmanuel Baptist Church, they showed their character while they invited Dylan Ruth in to sing hymns with them, welcome him in with open arms, irrespective of the fact that he was white. He then guns them down in cold-blooded murder. And what do? They come forth and they forgive him. They didn't go out and strap up in guns and say, let's burn down this place. So this fear somehow that there'll be retribution speaks to the projection on people of color, because that's not who we are as a people. And finally, what I think is that white people need to figure out and sort out, what is it within the spirit of whiteness that is broken, that makes it possible to create such savagery and tyranny around the globe, free of remorse? That's a question that white people have to ponder.
So if I may, Dr. Hardy, I want to ask a question that's related to what you are saying. I hear in a lot of complaints by whites who engage in these conversations and this work around the feeling of not feeling safe. that, you know, certain kinds of conversations make me feel unsafe. I don't know if I can continue with this. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, and you know, that's one of the, when I explicate these tasks of white people, that's one of them. I just didn't have time to get into that today because I think that it is commonplace for many white people to conflate safety and comfort. And so what I believe is, I appreciate that, Talithia, what I believe is that each and every one of us, each and every one of us is entitled to safety. Every last one of us. And no one of us is entitled to comfort. And so if you can't tolerate discomfort, then you can't do the work of an ally. Because I can tell you right now, I'm not comfortable saying any of the things I've said here today. I'm not comfortable saying them. But this cause is bigger than my comfort. And so I think it's important to draw that critical distinction between the two.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Is there someone that would like to ask one?
I have a question. I don't know how to raise my hand.
Go ahead.
You're on.
Am I okay? Can I ask?
Yes, I can hear you, Sally.
Okay, thank you. This has to do with, maybe it's linked to comfort, but the number 8 had to do with proactivity, and it was as an ally, learning how to and being willing to speak on behalf of race, being the one to say, what does it mean that there are no people of color in this room right now?
Right.
I mean, that kind of sort of awareness and sensitivity and sort of raising the issue. My note to myself was, have to be careful with this one, because my sense is that white people are always being in charge, are always taking control. And I feel like white people have to learn how to stand back. And so how do you balance that standing back with the proactivity that you were mentioning?
Well, because I think that I don't find very many white people who proactively step up and speak to racism. I find white people who react to it, that it usually falls on the shoulders of people of color. If there's that one person of color in the system, it becomes that person's job to bring up race. What I'm suggesting is, I think for the white person who aspires to be an ally, it's actually incumbent that you bring that up. I think there are other places where white people need to step back, but in terms of initiating conversations about race is not one of them, because we operate under a kind of gag order in the society around race. We don't talk about it. And when it comes up, it usually comes up at the expense of people of color, the labor of people of color, constantly bringing attention to it, only then to be accused of being race baiting or obsessed with race. And so my point is that race doesn't equal people of color. Race equals all of us. And so I think there's a responsibility that white people have to bring it up. I think other places where white people are taking up more space than they deserve, or speaking, correcting people of color, things like that. I think those are the places where one needs to push back. But that's part of the work, and knowing when is it that I as a white person need to step in, and where are the places where I need to step out. I think that's part of the consciousness raising about when you start interrogating what it means to be white, those things become exceedingly clearer, or they become less foggy.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
This is Cora. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I'd like to know what tools can be used when people of different, I shouldn't say races, because we're all one race, but different cultural groups marry each other, and it changes the whole dynamics of the family relationship as far as I'm concerned. Because when you, a Black person marries a white person, and they have children, how do you deal with the problems that arise in terms of the children? And one grandparent is very racist, have expressed racism by not having any pictures of them in their house. And of course, we are the accepting part of it. And how do you deal with that?
Well, I mean, like I think that the bigger issue is it's well beyond the children, you know, and I just think that that there's a hard conversation that the white partner has to have with his or her parents. And what I find about these issues is that not only is race hard to talk about in society, it's even harder to talk about within the context of family.
Mhm.
And so I just think that the white partner would be important to talk to their white parents and try to get and appeal to them that their love for their grandchild should be greater than their hatred of Black people.
Mhm.
And when I have these families in therapy, that is the very question I ask. Which is your hatred of Black people stronger than your love for your grandchildren? And
Yeah.
there's no beating around the bush. I mean, it's like that's the question.
Well,
And
I'm sorry.
no, and if you ask that question, I mean, I think you have to be prepared for the answer as well, because the answer may very well be yes.
Well, what she has to deal with her, or he has to deal with her raising and what she believes too, even though she's married this person, there are certain things that she still carries because of the fact of being raised a certain way. So, you know, what do you say to her or him? What do you say?
Well, I just like I think these issues you're raising are so colossal that I mean, I'm biased. I'm trained as a therapist. I'm a family therapist. So what I really believe is that couple would be helpful for them to get in therapy,
Mhm.
because this is not a like a one or two comment solution. That there are things that and this happens in our, so when two people sort of literally fall in love, and then what happens, issues of race and all these other dynamics tend to
Right.
run interference. They really need to be, I would suggest they go talk to someone, and then that someone they talk to have the long range goal of bringing the grandparents a part of that process.
And should all the family go into therapy?
I think it should start. I think it should start with the couple, and it should grow exponentially.
Okay.
Okay, and good luck to you.
Mhm. Thank you.
Okay, we have one question in the chat, which will be our last one. How do you respond to the statement, all lives matter?
You know, again, like I just think that historically that white people have been in a position of defining people of color's experiences, and people of color, we get trapped in defending our positions. So we see that the issue with the kneeling around the football games, the players clearly say this is about making statements of social justice. White people come along and said, oh, no, this is about the flag and about the military. And so when white people say that to me, my response is always that from where you stand as a white person, I can understand why that would be important to you to say. For me as a Black person, I find it offensive, because if all lives matter, we wouldn't need to have Black Lives Matter. And so I'm not trying to legislate what they say, but I want to hold fervently onto what I say and what I believe. And I think in these instances that our voice is important. And so that's, you know, I know we ought to just say two things. We have two strategies in our society for dealing with racial conflict. One is that we put our voices, like our mics are on mute, our voices are on mute. And so we live with this kind of tension that we know exists, but we don't acknowledge. The other strategy is that we attempt to have conversations about race, but they quickly escalate because we don't know how to do it. I think there's a third possibility. And that third possibility is, how do we constructively engage? But we need to have tools. We need to know how to do that. And so, like, that all lives matter comment is one that's begging for a deeper conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Hardy. And we're going to close this part of our program and let you go on with the rest of today. But before we do that, I want to say again, a very deep thank you. What we heard today was transformative, much needed, right when we needed to hear it. And I know one of the things I'm going to take away at the top is we have to be hope producers. Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for your words today, and we're going to stay in touch.
All right, thank you, and thanks for what you do. I really appreciate it. Thank you all for having me. It's been an honor and a blessing to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Such wisdom.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And so now
Thank
we
you.
get a chance to discuss this with one another. And let's go to our next slide with our ground rules for our conversation. So you're going to be put in chat rooms for about 20 minutes to process what you've heard from Dr. Hardy, as well as some of the questions that we have raised with him. And you see, we have some things we want to keep in mind as we have the conversation. So there are two questions that I'm going to ask you to choose which one you want to respond to. So what was new information for you today? That's one of the questions that you can take on. The second question is, what made you feel uncomfortable and why? Two questions. What was new information for you today? Or what did you hear that made you feel uncomfortable, was difficult for you to hear, and why? And so let's take a look at what we're going to be expecting in your small groups. That you participate with all of yourselves. All of us have both privileged selves and subjugated selves, and we want you to participate with all of yourselves and be able to tell which one is predominating in the conversation you are having with your small group members. Another one is, what is learned here should leave here. Dr. Hardy talked about the importance of speaking up and being a catalyst for the conversation. So the hope is that you will take what you have learned, and Cal pointed out he had 4 pages of notes, so he has a lot that he can share. It should leave here. It should go on from here to be talked about in your families, in your congregations, in your places of work, among people that you know. Expect non-closure. Please do not feel, okay, I've heard Dr. Hardy, I've got it fixed, I'm good with race, let's move on to the next thing. No, this is just, these are the beginning steps that we are engaging in with one another. There will not be closure today. When we disagree, become curious. What's the source of the disagreement? Please do not attempt to argue and prove your point. Just listen to one another. And if you notice disagreement, work with it yourself. Okay? When we agree, we get curious. What's the substance of the agreement? Are we actually agreeing, or are we muting ourselves? Another one, vulnerability and dissonance are seeds of transformation. If you feel, hopefully you feel uncomfortable. hopefully you'll instead of seeking to protect yourself, you'll leave the door of your vulnerability open, because this is the prerequisite for transformation. Then we want you to do your own work. Please do not ask the person of color who is in your group to explain what Dr. Hardy said. Please don't do that. Please. Don't put the burden on us. And don't contact us after the meeting to further explain what he said and why he said it and how wrong he was. Please don't do that. And I want to say to Black folks and people of color, you are not here to take care of white people. That is not your purpose. Not today. Let us all wrestle with what we have to wrestle with. Let us all grapple with what we have to grapple with. This word is for all of us, and none of us are experts. All right. So 20 minutes in your small group. Make sure the people of color are asked to speak first. And there'll be a 5-minute break for your needs after your small group period is over. Those of you who are going to want Spanish translation, please stay in the main room. If you get a join invitation, do not use it, or you'll be whisked away to a room where there is no translation. Okay, so we'll break up and we'll see you on the other.
We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. Freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Until the killing of black men, black mothers, sons is as important as the killing of white men, white mothers, sons. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Not needing to clutch for power, not needing the light just to shine on me. I need to be just one in the number as we stand against tyranny. To me, young people come first. They come first. They have the courage where we fail. If I can just shine a light on as they carry us through the gale. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. Freedom cannot rest. We who
So I want to thank everyone for coming and joining us today. Those of you who are still with us and those who had to go. I'll talk about this Sankofa bird at our next gathering because we are a little bit beyond our time right now, and I want to respect your time. This is the symbol that our co-moderators are using as a symbol of their work in our denomination, and it's an Akan West African symbol, Sankofa, which means go back and get what is useful to carry into the future. And that's an invitation to all of us. So we'll talk a little bit more about that at our next gathering. Our next gathering actually will be November 15. We are going to either mourn or celebrate the results of the election. But in either case, we're going to recommit ourselves to continue the work that is necessary to dismantle structural racism within our congregations and our communities, and also in our denomination. That work will continue no matter which of the candidates is victorious in the election.
And Rob, will we get a Zoom invitation for the next meeting on November 15th?
Yes, yes, you will all be invited just as you were to this. Just a word, we are recording this, and it will be available on our Presbytery website as soon as it is and ready, and you can share it with other folks. And so the last thing I'll say as an invitation is, so between now and we invite you to join us in prayer, that it be a peaceful transfer of power and that the will of the people is respected. We want you all to invite those of you who are, those you know who are of voting age, to check in with them to make sure that they vote, not saying how they should, but just encourage family members, congregational members, community members, please vote, please vote, please vote. I want to thank Jennifer Sacramento Street, who is our tech today. As always, a magician in preparing these things for us. We want to thank also our transitional leadership team that has supported this work from the very beginning, and thank all of you who are making these commitments to be hope manufacturers.
Is the recording of this available?
It will be available in a few days. It'll be posted on our Presbytery website.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, go in peace. Let me lift a closing prayer. Gracious God, we thank you. We thank you for what has enlightened us. We thank you for what has made us uncomfortable, because as Dr. Hardy said, we all have a right to safety, but none of us have a right to comfort. May these lessons and words work on us on the inside and prepare us to be better disciples of your Son, Jesus, and invite all in equity to the kingdom of God. Bless us in our worship services tomorrow, however we may be doing them, whether limited outside or virtual. May the word go forth, may the people be inspired, and may we all receive strength for the journey of life. In the name of your Son, Jesus, we pray. Amen.
Amen.